Hey students, today we are going to look at solving quadratic equations by factoring, and then we're going to find the value of x by using the zero product property. So first, let's talk about two things. Let's talk about what a quadratic equation is. We've seen them. So this is a quadratic equation, x squared plus 7x plus 10 equals 10. And the zero product property tells us if we are multiplying two things together and those two things equal zero, then one or both of those factors are equal to zero. And so our goal today is to take a quadratic equation, factor it into its two factors, set each factor equal to zero, and then solve for the value of x. And so this equation is only equal to zero when the value of x is -2 or -5. And so that's what we're going to look at today. So the top part of your paper is going to be the examples I'm going to work through with you, and the bottom part is like your little practice. And so again, if you want to write this down in your paper, you can. A quadratic function is in this form: 8x squared plus bx plus c, and this is standard form where a, b, and c are generally integers. And so here are 4 examples we're going to talk about today. Example 1 and 2 are a little different than what we talked about last week. Example 3 and 4 are exactly what we talked about last week. So before we can use the slip and slide method on example 1 and 2, first, we have to notice that in example 1 says 3x squared plus 9x minus 12. 3, 9, and 12 each have a number in common. And this poses an issue for us when we use the slip and slide method to factor it. If you look at example 3, 2, 3, and 5, they don't have a number in common, so we can use the slip and slide method here without an issue. Also in example 4, 8, 22, and 5, they don't have a number in common, so we can use the slip and slide method here without any issue. But when we have a quadratic equation that the 3 numbers in the equation, if they have a value in common, we have to first take that value out before we can use the slip and slide method. So in example 1, I look at this and I know that 3, 9, and 12, they all have a common factor of 3. So before we can use the slip and slide method, I am going to factor out, or I'm going to take out 3 from each term by dividing it. So if I know that if I divide 3 by 3, well, that leaves me with 1x squared. And if I divide 9 by 3, that leaves me with 3x. And if I divide 12 by 3, that leaves me with -4. And this trinomial, or this quadratic that I have left on the inside of the parentheses, this is what I'm going to use the slip and slide method with. And so, like we talked about last week, I take that first term and I'm going to multiply it by this one. So that gives me x squared plus 3x minus 4. And then I'm going to create my little diamond problem here. I have -4 and 3. And my goal is to try and determine what are the factors of -4 that give me +3. And remember, we talked about this in class. If you cannot think of the factors, then go to your calculator, go to the graph, do -4, divide that by x, enter, and then pull up the table, Control and T. And then these are all the factors of -4 here. And since I want a +3, I'm going to use -1 and +4 here will give me +3. And if you have trouble with adding that in your head, just add a calculator page and you can do -1 plus 4. And we see that that's 3. And we can easily click back over here to check other numbers as well. So I know that with my diamond problem here, my 2 numbers are going to be -1 and 4. And I'm going to use these 2 numbers in factoring it. So I'm going to split this up as x minus 1 and x plus 4. And so this is the same as what we did last week. The only addition is I had that number that I took out in the beginning, and I have to keep just bringing that number down. So the number that we multiplied by was 1. So if I divide this by 1 and I divide that by 1, it's just going to stay the same. So I end up with x minus 1 times x plus 4. And this is going to be equal to 0. This is the new part that we're doing today. The factoring part is not new. This taking the number out is new, but the factoring part itself is not new. What's new is setting it equal to 0 and determining what is the value of x here or here that makes this entire equation equal to 0. So now that we have it factored, we can take each factor, which is x minus 1, set it equal to 0, and x plus 4, set it equal to 0, and then we can solve for x. So this is a simple equation. I want to get the x by itself, so we got to undo the subtracting 1. And on this side, I want to get the x by itself, so I have to undo the adding 4. So we use our inverse operations. I know that if I add 1 to both sides, that's going to cancel out, and x is equal to 1. Or on this other factor, if we were to subtract 4, that's a 0 pair, cancels out, x is equal to negative 4. And so this is my solution to my equation. If I replace x up here with a 1, it's going to equal to 0. And if we replace x with negative 4, it should also equal to 0. I'm going to show that in the calculator screen, but not in the video because I don't have time. I only have 15 minutes. So let's look at the second example. I want you to think about, what does each one of these numbers have in common? I have 5x squared, I have a 20x, and I have a 60. So try to think about what number, because example 1 and 2 are essentially the same. We have to take a number out first before we can use a slip and slide method. So what number can we take out? If you thought 5, you would be correct. So now I divide each one of these numbers by 5. So 5 divided by 5, well, that's just 1x squared. And then I look at 20, and I also divide that by 5, and that is negative 4x. And I look at 60, and I divide that by 5, well, negative 60, because there's a minus sign there, and that will be negative 12. And of course, this is still equal to 0. And so now I want to do my slip and slide method, but I want to use it with only this inside the parentheses. So we're going to take our 1 and we're going to slip it over to the 12. And so that gives me x squared minus 4x minus 12. And when we do our diamond problem, I'm thinking of factors of negative 12 that are going to add up to negative 4. So again, if you're like, man, I really don't know what two numbers multiply to give me negative 12, but add up to negative 4, go to your calculator. You can hit tab. Well, just do a new document. No, add a graph. We have negative 12 divided by x. And then Control T. And these are all the factors of negative 12 here that you can add these together and figure out which one's going to give you negative 4. So hopefully you figured out that what we're going to add together is negative 6 and positive 2. So I'm going to take this and write x minus 6 and x plus 2. And I got to bring down that 5 because that's the number that we divided out earlier. Now, the number that we slipped over was the 1. So if I divide each of these by 1, that's just going to stay the same. So I'm not going to show that this time. Well, I'll show it just for posterity. So x minus 6, x plus 2, this is equal to 0 because now what we're adding is, can we solve and can we find the two x values that will make our equation equal to 0? So that's when I'm going to take each component of this, and set the factors equal to 0. X minus 6 equal to 0, x plus 2, set that equal to 0, and then we solve it. So we solve it like we solve any equation that we've dealt with before, and you could still use insolve for this part here, the x minus 6 equals 0, but this is pretty simple. I'm just going to add 6 to both sides. That's a 0 pair, so x is equal to positive 6, or I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. That's a 0 pair, and x is equal to negative 2. So those are my two solutions for this particular quadratic. X is equal to 6 or x is equal to negative 2. Now, we can check this. All right, for us to check this, we're actually going to do this in our calculator. I'm going to take this original equation and I'm going to replace x with 6. So this x and this x, and then I'm going to take that same equation and replace x with negative 2 to show that it equals 0. And I want you to do this with me. So let's go home, new document, no, add a calculator, and we're going to type in 5 times 6 squared, because that was the x value, minus 20 times 6, and then minus 60, and we get 0. So that one number in both places of x will make it equal to 0. And then if we check the other one, it was 5 times negative 2. And notice I'm using parentheses because I'm replacing x with the value. I need to put that in parentheses. Negative 2 again, and then minus 60. So the two numbers that we found were the only two numbers that will make the equation, the quadratic equation, equal to 0. And so that's our goal today, to do that. Now, for example, 3 and 4, those are just like what we did last week. There's nothing different. Because there's no number that 2, 3, and 5 have in common, you don't have to do this step here. And the same thing with example 4, 8, 22, and 5, they don't have a number in common, so you won't do this step here. So instead, that'll be normal. So for example 2, I went ahead and set this one up for you. You still do the A, you still take the 2, slip it over to the 5, we get negative 10, so negative 10. Here are the two factors, and then I just want you to see, can you solve this for 0, and can you solve this for 0? So go ahead and do that for me, and then try example 4, and I'll show the work for that one. So these are the two solutions for example 3 when x is 5 halves, or when x is 1. This quadratic equation up here is going to be equivalent to 0. So example 4, same thing, slip the 8 over to 5, and we get x squared minus 22x plus 40. You should find your two factors here, and you can factor this out as x minus 20 and x minus 2. But remember, you got to divide that by 8 since that's the number we slipped over earlier. And the fractions reduce, but that's not our answer because we have to slide that 2 over and slide that 4 over just like before. And so these are my two factors. And again, I want you to solve those and see if you can tell me what the solutions are. And so for your practice problems for today, number 1 and number 2 are just like above, and I want you to think about what number does 2, 10, and 8 have in common. So what number can you take out of both of those? Same thing with number 2. What number does 4, 24, and 28 have in common? So you can take a number out of both of those. If you're having trouble, just generally try dividing these two terms by this first one to see if you get a whole number. Same thing with this one. Try dividing 24 and 28 by 4 to see if you get a whole number. If you get a whole number, then that's the number you can take out. Number 3 and number 4 are just like what we did last week, or just like example 3 and example 4, where you don't have to take anything out and you just go straight to the slip and slide method. If you have any questions over these, please feel free to ask, because that's what I'm here for. So this is what you should have gotten for number 1, and then I'll let you do the rest there. For your practice today, I'm going to have you go to Khan Academy. If you finish the notes and all the your try it part, you'll log in the top corner and you should be practicing factoring and solving quadratic equations.